All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. So today we're taking a deep dive into natural deduction and logic. And we've got a great set of ideas that we've gathered. And our mission is to um, extract the most valuable insights for you. So um, let's jump right in. Natural deduction really tries to uh, present logic in a way that mirrors how we actually reason on a day-to-day basis. And one of the key insights of natural deduction is this idea of the subproof.
Yeah, and the subproof is basically a mini argument where we temporarily make an assumption just to see where it leads.
Right.
It's like saying, okay, let's just suppose this is true for a moment, just for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
What can we conclude from this? And then the really neat thing is that often you can conclude an if-then statement without being committed to that initial assumption.
Yeah, you're right. It's really powerful that way. You can say, well, if this were true, then this would follow.
Yeah.
And you've kind of discharged that initial premise.
Exactly.
So when we look at the broader landscape of logical systems, natural deduction stands out because of this explicit handling of assumptions.
Yeah.
Some other proof methods might operate differently, but natural deduction really puts this, assuming for the sake of argument, front and center.
That's right.
Now, when you start looking into natural deduction, you soon realize there isn't just one way it's presented. Our sources discuss a few key approaches, and there's Genson's original work in 1934, which used these kind of interesting branching proof trees.
Yeah, so what's interesting about Genson's tree format is how it visually represents the flow of the argument. You start with the assumptions and you work your way down to the final conclusion. And so the final conclusion would be like at the root of the tree, and then the initial assumptions would be at the leaves. And he would use numbering to track which assumptions are active
Oh, okay.
in different parts of the proof.
I see. Then, also in 1934, we have Joskowski, who introduced this really intuitive concept of boxes to visually enclose the subproofs.
Yeah, the boxes make it really visually clear what's under the scope of a particular assumption.
Right.
And that once you step out of the box, you can't just carry those conclusions with you.
Yeah.
You have to kind of acknowledge that they were based on that initial assumption.
And then there's what's often called the modern Fitch style, which I think you'll likely see in many current logic textbooks today. And it simplifies the boxes a bit and just uses these vertical lines to enclose the subproof. So
Yeah.
interestingly, these three very different visual styles, right? We've got trees, boxes, and lines.
Right.
But they kind of reveal this fundamental insight that this core logic of assumption and discharge can be represented in a variety of ways.
Yeah, it's suggestive that there's something deeper going on, right? Some underlying principle there.
Exactly. And it wasn't an overnight sensation, this natural deduction idea. While those initial formulations were in 34, it really gained more momentum in the 50s and 60s as more and more logic textbooks started adopting these methods.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the intuitive appeal of natural deduction, right? It seemed to resonate with logicians and educators as a way of formalizing reasoning that just felt, well, natural.
Yeah, it does feel very, very natural. Now, this isn't just about like a neat way to write down proofs. There's a deeper idea connecting natural deduction to the very meaning of logical words, like and or if not,
Yeah.
and so on.
Right. So I think a radical insight of natural deduction is that it's not like the meaning of these words is some kind of abstract truth floating out there. Rather, the meaning of these logical words is actually defined by the rules that govern how we introduce and eliminate them in our arguments.
Oh, so for example, if we want to understand and, it's really all bound up in the rules. Like if we know that A is true and B is true, we can introduce A and B. And conversely, if we know A and B, we can eliminate the and conclude that A is true.
Yeah.
And that B is true. So it's this interplay of introduction and elimination that really, for some, defines the very essence of these logical terms.
Right. So the key is that the rules themselves are constitutive of meaning. It's not like, we understand what and means and then we formulate the rules. It's rather that, no, the rules for how we introduce and eliminate and are its meaning.
Yeah.
That's what it means within this logical system.
That is really interesting. And this leads us to some pretty interesting philosophical debates that our source material kind of hints at things like, is there one true logic?
Right.
What is the relationship between logic and language and even metaphysics?
Yeah, and I think this raises an interesting question for us as philosophers. Like, if the meaning of logical terms is tied to their use in inference, as natural deduction so clearly illustrates, does this give us a basis for, say, preferring one logical system over another?
Right.
Right. So, for instance, intuitionists argue that their logic, which often aligns really nicely with this meaning as use idea,
Right.
is somehow more fundamental fundamental or correct than classical logic.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that they point out that intuitionistic logic tends to have this nice balance between introduction and elimination rules for its connectives,
Mm.
which is sometimes called harmony.
Right.
But as we'll see, this idea of harmony isn't without its challenges.
Yes, exactly.
And if we try to connect this further, some philosophers have even tried to extend this idea beyond just formal logic and understand the meaning of words in our everyday language.
Right.
And this line of thinking is called inferentialism and sees meaning as fundamentally tied to these inferential roles
Exact.
that words play in our reasoning and communication.
So the idea is that the way we reason, the inferences we make, are actually constitutive of what our words mean.
It's a pretty profound idea, right? Like the structure of logic as revealed by natural deduction might hold clues not just to how we reason formally, but also to how language works
Yeah.
and how we understand the world around us. I mean, we're just scratching the surface here, but we'll see as we delve deeper how these seemingly abstract logical systems have some very concrete and far-reaching philosophical implications.
So as we continue our deep dive, I think a central tension to keep in mind is, on the one hand, we've got natural deduction, which is this very intuitive system of reasoning. But then on the other hand, there's all of this philosophical weight that's been placed on its features, especially the meaning of logical terms and the nature of logic itself.
Yeah, it's a journey that will take us from the structure of proofs to some of the biggest questions in philosophy.
Exactly.
All right, so let's keep digging into the details. We've talked about these different ways natural deduction can be presented. Gentz's trees, Jaschkowski's boxes, the modern Fitch style. But no matter what it looks like visually, the core idea is the subproof, right?
Right.
And how we use those temporary assumptions.
And what's crucial is that these subproofs allow us to derive conditional statements. So by assuming A within a subproof and then deriving B, we can then conclude if A, then B outside the subproof. And we've discharged that initial assumption of A.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And this ability to embed assumptions within assumptions is really key, right?
Yeah.
It allows for this really complex reasoning where we can explore hypothetical scenarios within hypothetical scenarios,
Exactly.
all while keeping track of what depends on what.
And crucially, the source emphasizes that we need some kind of method to prevent us from misusing conclusions that were derived within the subproof once we've stepped outside of it.
Right.
And those visual markers, like the closed boxes or the ended vertical lines, they serve precisely that purpose. They show us the scope of an assumption.
I see. Okay. So beyond the mechanics of these subproofs, natural deduction really shines in how it handles these logical connectives through what are called introduction and elimination rules. We touched on this earlier, but let's get a bit more specific now.
Sure, yeah. So as we mentioned, for each logical connective, like and, or, if then, and not, natural deduction typically provides a rule for introducing a statement with that connective, and then a rule or rules for eliminating it.
Okay, so for and, for example, introduction rule is really simple. If you've got A and you've got B, you can introduce A and B.
Right.
The elimination rules let you go from A and B to just A or A and B to just B.
Right, and as Gentzen himself noted, the idea is that the introduction rules kind of define the meaning of the connectives.
Okay.
By specifying when we're justified in asserting a statement that contains them, and then the elimination rules show us what we can infer from such a statement.
Got it.
So they're like consequences of that definition.
So the introduction is like the definition, and then elimination is like what follows from that.
Okay.
I like that.
Exactly.
So the rule for implication, or if-then, is really interesting because it directly uses that subproof idea. To introduce A implies B, we assume A in a subproof and show that B follows. Then outside that subproof, we can conclude A implies B.
Right.
And the elimination rule for implication is just modus ponens.
Exactly, yeah. So if we know A implies B is true, and we know that A is true, then we can conclude that B is true.
Now for or, the introduction is pretty straightforward again.
Huh.
If we know that A is true, we can introduce A or B,
Right.
but the elimination rule for or is a bit more involved.
Yeah, a bit more complex, but it essentially requires us to show that a certain conclusion C follows both from the assumption that A is true and from the assumption that B is true.
Okay.
So if we can do that, then we can conclude C even if we don't know which of A or B is actually the case.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, for not, the introduction rule often involves showing that assuming the statement leads to a contradiction.
Right.
So you end up with B and not B. If you can do that, then you can conclude not A. And the elimination rule for negation, at least in some systems, allows us to infer any statement from a contradiction, which is a very powerful and sometimes controversial principle known as ex falsum quod libet.
Right. So that can seem strange at first, right? Like, how could we infer anything from a contradiction? But the idea is that if we've reached a genuine contradiction, then something must have done wrong with our initial assumptions. And so any inferences we make from there are kind of unreliable.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, our source points out that, these different natural deduction systems can have slightly different rules.
Yeah.
And sometimes one type of rule, like a rule of suppositions involving a subproof, can be replaced by a rule of inference that doesn't use a subproof.
Right.
But the core idea of having these introduction and elimination rules for each connective really remains central to the spirit of natural deduction.
Exactly. And again, that in Elam structure is not just a convenient way of organizing the rules. It actually has a deeper significance for many philosophers about the meaning of the logical connectives and the very nature of logical validity.
Right. So we've been talking about these propositional connectives, but natural deduction also extends to handle quantifiers like for all and there exists. The rules for these are, as our source mentions, a bit more complex, but they can be seen as analogous to the rules for and or, respectively.
Right. So I like to think of for all as kind of like a massive conjunction over all the individuals in a certain domain. So if something is true for all X, then it must be true for any specific instance.
Right.
So the elimination rule for all allows us to infer that, if it's true for all X, it's true for, say, A.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the introduction rule for all is where we again see the use of a subproof,
Right.
often involving a dummy term or special term. And so the idea is to show that this statement holds for an arbitrary term that hasn't been subject to any special assumption.
Exactly.
And if we can do that, we can then generalize and conclude that it's true for all X.
Right. And the key there is that we can't have made any special assumptions about that term within the subproof.
Okay.
Because we want to ensure that our generalization really is about any element in the domain.
Right. Okay. And for the existential quantifier, or there exists, the introduction rule is pretty straightforward. If we know the statement is true for a specific thing, then we can conclude that there exists something for which the statement is true.
Right.
But the elimination rule for there exists, again, involves a subproof with this special term. And if we know there exists an X such that A of X, we can introduce a special term, let's call it A, and assume that A of A is true within a subproof. And then if we can derive a conclusion that doesn't rely on that special term, then we can infer that conclusion outside of the subproof.
Right. And it's kind of like saying, we know something has this property, so let's just give it a name. We'll call it A and see what follows. And if we can reach a conclusion that doesn't rely on the specific identity of A, then that conclusion must hold regardless of which thing actually has the property.
Okay, that's a really neat way to think about it. Now, the source also mentions that some older textbooks use different, sometimes even problematic rules for quantifiers, things like existential instantiation, or EI, and universal generalization, or UJD. These rules, unlike the standard natural deduction rules, don't actually involve subproofs.
Right. So the problem with these rules, although they can lead to shorter proofs in some cases, is that they're really tricky to get right.
Okay.
And so a lot of incorrect formulations of these rules appeared in textbooks, throughout the years. And the key issue is that it's difficult to manage the restrictions on when and how you can use these special terms that get introduced by these rules, because you want to make sure the logic remains sound.
Right. You don't want to be proving things that aren't actually true. And it sounds like the lack of a clear semantic interpretation for these instantial terms also caused a lot of issues.
Right, exactly. So unlike the standard natural deduction approach, these rules felt more like a formal trick, It's not really clear what they mean.
Okay, so I think we've got a good handle on the basic structure of natural deduction, the role of these subproofs, how it handles logical connectives and quantifiers. Now, I'm really excited to steer this deep dive into some of the more philosophical areas. What do you think?
Yeah, let's get philosophical. So what's really fascinating is that natural deduction was initially conceived of just as this formal system, but it's become central to various philosophical discussions, especially around the meaning of logical terms and the foundations of logic.
Right. One really important idea in this area is normalization. So normalization is this process of streamlining proofs to remove unnecessary steps, right? It's like you're cleaning up a proof.
Yeah.
And this is a huge meta-theorem about natural deduction that says any proof in the system can be transformed into what's called a normal form, where in Genson's words, it's not roundabout.
Yeah, it's kind of like optimizing the proof, right? Removing unnecessary detours
Yeah.
or applications of rules that immediately undo each other.
So it's like if you introduce an and then you immediately eliminate it.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a kind of redundancy that normalization tries to get rid of.
Okay. And Genson proved this normalization theorem for his intuitionistic natural deduction system. He really thought that those introduction rules were defining the connectives, and the elimination rules were consequences of those definitions. So in a normal proof, you're not going to introduce something just to immediately eliminate it.
Exactly.
It's redundant.
Right.
Now, the normalization theorem has some really interesting consequences, including the subformula property, which applies to these normal derivations in intuitionistic logic.
Right. And this subformula property means that every formula that appears in a normal proof is a subformula of either the premises or the conclusion.
Okay, so that means that in a streamlined proof, you don't need to put in any new concepts or ideas that weren't already present in what you started with or what you're trying to prove.
Really, yeah. And that has some really interesting consequences for things like the decidability of propositional logic,
Right.
because it puts a limit on the complexity of proofs that we need to consider. But normalization for classical logic proved to be a bit more challenging.
Yeah, he actually had to develop his sequent calculus
Right.
as an alternative system in order to prove a similar result, which he called the Hauptsatz for both classical and intuitionistic logic. Our source mentioned that Genson was kind of disappointed that he couldn't get normalization to work as cleanly for classical natural deduction.
Right. And it actually wasn't until much later that Dag Prowlitz provided a proof of the normalization theorem for intuitionistic natural deduction. And even for classical logic, although it initially seemed elusive, it turns out that von Plato and Siders gave a relatively simple proof of a fully general normalization theorem much more recently.
Wow, okay. It's interesting how all of these really technical results about proof theory can fuel these really interesting philosophical debates. Like, for instance, the fact that intuitionistic logic has this very strong normalization property, and it seems to really fit Genson's idea of these introduction rules as definitions.
Right.
Well, this has led some philosophers to argue that intuitionistic logic is the one true logic, and Michael Dummett is probably the most famous proponent of this view.
Right, and the idea here hinges on this fear that a good logical system should have what's called a harmonious set of introduction and elimination rules.
Right, and by harmonious we mean the elimination rules are justified by and only serve to undo the effect of the introduction rules.
Exactly. And Dummett argued that classical logic, with its reliance on things like the law of excluded middle,
Right.
doesn't fit this harmonious picture as well.
Yeah, but this idea of harmony is not universally accepted.
Yeah.
Right. Our source brings up Pryor's very clever TONK example, which is a connective defined by an introduction rule that lets you infer A TONK from A, and an elimination rule that lets you infer B from A TONK B. So what's clever about this is that it seems to have perfectly valid introduction and elimination rules.
Right.
But as Pryor pointed out, it actually leads to a trivial logic where you can prove anything from anything.
Yeah. So what this showed is that just having interim rules, just having introduction and elimination rules is not enough. There need to be some constraints on how those rules relate to each other.
Right, so it can't just be any random introduction and elimination rules, right?
Yeah.
They have to have this special connection.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we actually define that connection?
Yeah. Well, so Belknap, in response to Pryor, said, look, the meaning of a connective is not just given by some interim rules. These rules have to fit in with the rest of the language. And the elimination rule should really only reverse the effect of the introduction rule. So this led to the development of the concept of harmony, which is basically the idea that the introduction and elimination rules for a connective should be in this kind of equilibrium,
Right.
where the elimination rules allow us to derive exactly what we need based on how the connective was introduced and nothing more.
And our source points out that many philosophers really see this harmony as a key feature of a well-behaved logical connective.
Right.
And some even argue that the one true logic should be the one where all connectives have this property, which again points toward intuitionistic logic.
Exactly, yeah.
But the source brings up a really interesting challenge to this harmony ideal with the case of identity.
Yes. Identity.
The introduction rule for identity is just reflexivity.
Right.
A equals A, and the elimination rule allows for substitution. So if A equals B and A of A is true, then A of B is true. but it's not immediately obvious how this elimination rule really just undoes the introduction rule, right?
Right. It's not as clear cut as with some of the other connectives. And so there have been various attempts to define more harmonious rules for identity.
Right, and our source mentions one by Reed, which is based on the principle of indiscernibility.
Right. But then this brings in all sorts of other complexities. For instance, we have to start talking about truly arbitrary predicates. And it raises questions about whether we're even still in the realm of basic logic.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is how this seemingly simple concept of identity can create such a big challenge to this very powerful philosophical idea of harmony.
Exactly, and it suggests that maybe this interlome ideal is a bit more nuanced, or perhaps it even has limitations.
Right, right. And this whole discussion about these harmonious intelim rules
Hmm.
doesn't just stay within formal logic, right?
Right.
It's had a major influence on theories of meaning and philosophy of language.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is where we get into the idea of inferentialism, which offers an alternative to more traditional denotational or representational theories of meaning. These traditional theories try to understand meaning in terms of how words refer to things in the world. But inferentialism says, no, no, no. The meaning of an expression is given by the rules governing its use,
Okay.
particularly its role in inferences.
So just like the int elem rules in natural deduction
Mhm.
are seen by some as defining the meaning of these logical connectives,
Right.
inferentialists would argue that the meaning of all linguistic items is determined by these rules of their introduction and exploitation within our discussions.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So, for example, to really understand the word bachelor, an inferentialist would say it's to understand the conditions under which we're justified in calling someone a bachelor.
Right. Huh?
So, he's an unmarried man of a certain age, let's say, and then also what follows from someone being a bachelor.
Yeah,
He's probably single, probably doesn't have children.
I like that. And this view has some really appealing aspects. It avoids the need to posit these abstract entities, like non-actual states of affairs, to try to explain the meaning of, empty names or false propositions.
Right.
It really grounds meaning in our actual practices of using language.
Yeah, exactly.
And this really connects back to natural deduction, right?
Absolutely. The idea is that the success of natural deduction in capturing how we reason, with its in alum rules, provides a model for how meaning might work more generally.
Yeah.
And so Dummett and Brandom are two key figures who have explored these ideas in great detail.
Yeah, and Dummett in particular has used this connection to natural deduction
Right.
and the emphasis on use to really argue for his philosophical position of anti-realism.
Right. And Dummett argues that classical logic, with its reliance on this pre-given notion of truth and falsity, commits us to a very problematic meaning holism, which actually makes language learning impossible.
Okay, so can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So Dummett's argument hinges on what he calls the manifestation criterion. The idea is that language learners have to have some way of showing that they understand a term.
Right.
And he says that classical semantics, which appeals to this independent semantic reality, doesn't provide such a way of demonstrating understanding, whereas a more use-based understanding of meaning, as championed by intuitionistic logic, actually does.
Yeah, so for Dummett, the way we learn and use these logical terms, the introduction and elimination rules we're implicitly following, actually shapes our understanding of reality.
Right, exactly. So if classical logic can't give a good account of how we learn to use its connectives, then its underlying metaphysical assumptions might be flawed as well.
Yeah. And this is a pretty radical conclusion. It suggests that our choice of logic isn't just a matter of formal convenience. It has these deep implications for our metaphysics, for our understanding of what the world is really like.
Exactly, yeah. And Dummett's anti-realism has been a major topic of debate in contemporary philosophy.
It really is amazing how a formal system, like natural deduction, can lead to such deep and far-reaching philosophical discussions about the nature of meaning, logic, and reality itself.
Absolutely. It's not just a tool for proving theorems. It's really a lens through which we can examine some of the most fundamental questions about how we think and how we understand the world.
So let's recap our deep dive into natural deduction today. We've seen how it's a logical system that's built on this intuitive idea of making assumptions and exploring the consequences of those assumptions through these subproofs.
Right.
We looked at the different ways it can be presented, Gens's trees, Fitch's notation, all sharing that core mechanism. And then we talked about the relationship between natural deduction and these philosophical ideas about meaning.
Right, so particularly this notion that the meaning of logical connectives is tied to their introduction and elimination rules.
Right.
We also talked about the an Illim ideal, the
Yes.
concept of harmony between these rules, as well as some challenges to that.
Breyer's TONK. The
Exactly.
complexities of identity.
And then finally, we explored some of the broader philosophical consequences of this, including the argument that the structure of logic, specifically natural deduction with harmonious rules, can inform how we understand the meaning in natural language through this view called inferentialism.
Right.
And we even saw how this can lead to these big metaphysical positions like Dummett's anti-realism.
Yeah, and Dummett's anti-realism basically questions this idea that there's a mind-independent reality.
Right, exactly. So at the heart of Dummett's argument is this idea of a warranted assertability, that our understanding of meaning should be based on the conditions under which we're justified in using language,
Okay.
rather than on some presumed grasp of this pre-existing world of facts. And this really challenges the realist view that meaning is grounded in reality, independent of our linguistic practices.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Considering how natural deduction places such a strong emphasis on the process of reasoning from assumptions,
Yeah.
how might this influence how we approach complex problems or evaluate different viewpoints in our everyday lives? Does focusing on the steps of inference, rather than just the final conclusion, give us a valuable lens for understanding and engaging with the world around us?
Yeah, I think so. By paying closer attention to the assumptions being made and the inferences being drawn, both in our own reasoning and in the arguments of others, we can gain a much deeper understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of different positions. And hopefully, we can move towards more reasoned and well-supported conclusions. It's a reminder that the how of our thinking is just as important as the what.
Very well said. All right, that's it for the deep dive. Thanks for listening.